Jake Harrison had been staring at the empty screen for 20 minutes, and nothing made sense anymore because the colonies were just gone, and nobody could explain why. He commanded the ESS Valiant, and right now his job was to figure out what happened to 4 million people who lived on 12 different worlds beyond the Kepler belt. Sophie Blake sat at her station running the same tests over and over again, hoping for different results, but the data never changed. The space around those colonies was different now, and the instrument showed readings that shouldn't be possible. According to everything humanity knew about physics, Marcus Webb came to the bridge holding a tablet with shaking hands, and Jake knew immediately that whatever the scientist had found was going to make things worse. The readings showed that space itself was changing in those areas, like the universe was rewriting its own rules, and Jake felt cold despite the warm air on the bridge. Sophie turned around with wide eyes and said the gravitational constant was shifting every few hours in the affected zones, and that should be impossible because constants were supposed to stay constant. Carl Davis was the youngest member of the crew, and he kept checking his instruments like he didn't trust what they were telling him. The Valiant moved closer to New Terra, which had been home to 500,000 colonists, and Jake gave the order even though every instinct told him to turn back. They picked up a message repeating over and over, and when Sophie cleaned up the signal, they all heard Helen Morris warning them to stay away. The colony administrator sounded terrified, and her voice cracked when she said that space was no longer stable, and the universe was rejecting them. Marcus analyzed the message and found something that made his face go pale because the timestamp showed the message was 3 weeks old, but the quantum signature said it was sent 3 hours ago. Time was breaking down out here, and Jake wondered if they would make it back home to report what they found. The Valiant crossed into New Terra's orbital space, and what they saw made no sense because the colony was there, but also not there at the same time. Buildings flickered between different states of existence, and Sophie's scans showed the structures existed in 17 different quantum states simultaneously. The colonists were alive in some states and dead in others, and present in some but absent in the rest. Marcus said it was like the universe had decided humans didn't belong here and was trying to edit them out of existence. Jake ordered full scans of everything while Carl tried to raise anyone on the surface, but all he got was static mixed with sounds that hurt to listen to. The Valiant's computers struggled to process the data because nothing followed the normal rules anymore, and Sophie suggested they leave before whatever happened to the colony happened to them too. Marcus wanted to stay longer to gather more information, but Jake saw the fear in his eyes. They spent 6 hours documenting everything they could, and then Jake gave the order to pull back because losing his ship and crew wouldn't help anyone. The journey back to Earth took 3 weeks, and Jake spent most of that time writing reports that sounded insane even to him. Sophie analyzed all the data they collected and found patterns that suggested this wasn't random, but was instead spreading outward from the affected zones. Marcus worked with the other scientists via quantum communication, and together they developed theories that all sounded like science fiction. Carl monitored all the channels and reported that more colonies were going silent every day. By the time the Valiant reached Earth orbit, 3 more systems had fallen into the same strange state, and panic was spreading through humanity's space territories. Jake met with General Patricia Kane, who commanded Earth's defense forces, and she listened to his report with a grim expression. Lisa Park was the best quantum physicist humanity had, and she joined the meeting along with Greg Foster from Intelligence. Lisa said the data suggested that human presence was somehow triggering a response from space itself, like they had crossed some invisible line. Greg had been tracking which areas were affected, and found that every single one had high levels of human activity and advanced technology. Jake remembered Helen Morris's warning about the universe rejecting them, and wondered if humanity had pushed too far into space. Lisa proposed that maybe consciousness itself was the problem, because human minds and human technology operated on principles that conflicted with how space naturally worked. Marcus joined the discussion through a video link and suggested that perhaps they had woken something up with 3 centuries of faster-than-light travel. Every time humanity used a quantum drive, they broke causality temporarily, and maybe reality was finally pushing back against that violation. The meeting lasted 8 hours and ended with more questions than answers, but everyone agreed on one thing, which was that humanity needed to act fast. Patricia Kane ordered the formation of special research teams to study the phenomenon, while Jake was assigned to lead evacuation efforts. Sophie and Carl both volunteered to continue working with him, while Marcus joined Lisa's research team. Danny Wright commanded the exploration fleet, and he refused to consider abandoning the colonies without a fight. Nicole Sanders was an engineer who proposed building ships that could adapt to changing physical laws, and her idea caught everyone's attention. She explained that if they couldn't stop space from changing, then humanity needed to change with it through adaptive technology and maybe even adaptive humans. Patricia approved the Prometheus project immediately and put out a call for volunteers willing to undergo experimental modifications. The project would create vessels that existed partially outside normal space-time, crewed by people whose consciousness had been expanded across multiple quantum states. Jake volunteered within an hour of hearing about the project because sitting in meetings while people died wasn't something he could do. Sophie and Marcus both signed up too, along with 5,000 others from across human space. Lisa warned them that the modifications would be painful and dangerous and that they might not survive the process. But Jake didn't care. The phenomenon was spreading faster now, and whole systems were flickering in and out of stable existence. Time was running out for millions of colonists trapped in impossible quantum states. The modifications began 2 weeks after the project's approval, and Jake went first because that's what commanders did. Lisa explained that she would expand his consciousness across multiple quantum states, allowing him to perceive and adapt to shifting physical constants. The process felt like being torn apart and reassembled wrong, and for 72 hours Jake existed somewhere between human and something else entirely. When he finally stabilized, he could see things he hadn't been able to see before, like the way space rippled and shifted around him. Sophie came through the process next, and then Marcus. And one by one the volunteers transformed into something more than human, but less than whatever lived in the spaces between stars. Brian Clark was a pilot who emerged from his modification with eyes that seemed to look through normal reality. And he said quietly that space wasn't turning against humanity, but was instead waking up. Jake understood what he meant because now he could feel it too. A vast presence that permeated all of space and was aware of them in ways that made him feel very small and very young. The ESS Frontier launched 3 months after the Prometheus project began, and Laura Bennett commanded the first ship designed to exist partially outside normal reality. Her crew consisted entirely of modified humans who could perceive the shifting nature of space, and Jake served as her second in command. The ship itself looked wrong to normal human eyes because parts of it seemed to fade in and out of existence, but to the enhanced crew, it made perfect sense. Sophie worked the navigation station and could plot courses through regions where normal space-time had fractured into pieces. Marcus ran the science lab where he studied the phenomenon that was consuming more and more of human space. Their mission was simple in theory but impossible in practice, because they needed to stabilize reality around trapped colonies long enough to evacuate millions of people. The Frontier entered the first affected zone near New Terra, and Laura felt the universe shift around them in ways that would have torn apart a normal ship. Kevin Morris was their chief engineer, and he had developed techniques for collapsing quantum superpositions, safely bringing people back from existing in multiple states. The crew worked 18-hour days trying to save as many colonists as possible while the affected zones continued spreading. Jake stood on the bridge watching rescue operations and could feel the vast presence in space watching them back with something like curiosity. They saved 2 million people in the first month, pulling them out of quantum prisons and sending them back to stable space on evacuation ships. Sophie reported that the phenomenon was spreading faster than they could work, and more colonies were falling into superposition every week. Marcus spent his time analyzing the spatial anomalies and found patterns that didn't seem natural or random but instead looked purposeful. On day 40, 3 of rescue operations, Marcus called everyone to the lab because he had found something that changed everything. The spatial anomalies weren't random at all, but instead followed complex mathematical patterns that looked like language. Sophie worked with him to decode the patterns using her enhanced perception, and what they discovered made Jake's breath catch in his throat. Space itself was trying to communicate with them, and the entity causing all this chaos was intelligent and aware. Laura ordered the Frontier to hold position while they worked to understand the message. Sophie spent 3 weeks parsing patterns across multiple dimensions, because the message existed in more than just 3-dimensional space. The other enhanced crew members helped by perceiving aspects of the communication that normal humans couldn't detect. Ryan Clark said the message felt confused rather than hostile, and Jake agreed because his own enhanced senses picked up emotional undertones in the spatial fluctuations. Marcus finally assembled a rough translation that shook everyone who heard it because the entity was asking why humans made noise in the silence and why they burned where there should be cold. The message continued, asking why humanity persisted where nothing should exist, and Jake realized they were dealing with something that had existed in space long before humans looked up at the stars. Laura reported their findings to Earth, and the response came back within hours because General Patricia Kane had assembled every enhanced human and every scientist to help interpret what they had learned. Lisa Park proposed that space wasn't empty at all, but instead contained an ecosystem that humans couldn't perceive with normal senses. Human technology, especially faster than light drives, caused pain to this entity, like humanity had been strip mining someone's home without realizing anyone lived there. The political situation back on Earth was getting worse because billions of humans lived off-world and the economy depended on space travel and resource extraction. Patricia Kane faced pressure to either solve the problem or abandon the affected colonies, and neither option seemed possible. Danny Wright and the exploration fleet worked around the clock evacuating colonists, but there were too many people in too many places. Nicole Sanders continued developing adaptive technology, but even her best work couldn't stop the spreading phenomenon. Jake worked with Sophie and Marcus to establish real communication with the entity they had started calling the silence because that's what it valued most. The enhanced humans could exist partially in the same quantum space as the silence, and that made them natural translators between two completely different forms of consciousness. Laura Bennett spent hours in a meditative state reaching out to the silence and slowly building understanding between humanity and something vast beyond comprehension. The silence didn't understand discrete consciousness like humans had, because it experienced all of space simultaneously, and human colonies were like constant irritating static. Kevin Morris developed the first prototype quantum masking technology that could hide humanity's signature from the silence, and early tests showed promise. The silence didn't want to destroy humanity, but simply wanted the painful noise to stop, and Jake felt hope for the first time in months. Sophie helped refine the masking technology, while Marcus worked on making it efficient enough for widespread deployment. Ryan Clark tested it on his shuttle and reported that the silence seemed less agitated when the masking was active. Laura established the first real dialogue with the silence. Through a combination of quantum mathematics and enhanced perception, the entity made its position clear, which was that humanity could keep what they currently had but could not expand any further into space. The age of unlimited exploration was over, and humanity had reached the boundary of how far they could spread. Patricia Kane received this news with mixed feelings, because accepting limits went against everything humanity had believed for 3 centuries. Greg Foster analyzed the political implications and warned that many colonies would resist any agreement that restricted growth. Jake understood both sides of the argument because humanity needed space to survive, but they also needed to survive, period, and fighting the silence seemed impossible. The entity existed in the fabric of space itself and could rewrite physical laws in any region it chose. Lisa Park pointed out that learning to coexist with the silence was humanity's greatest opportunity because the entity knew things about reality that humans had never imagined. Danny Wright spoke before the United Earth Council and argued that wisdom meant knowing when to stop rather than how far to go. The debate lasted weeks while more colonies flickered in and out of stable existence, and Jake spent that time helping evacuate trapped colonists. Sophie worked on improving the quantum masking technology until it could protect entire planets from causing disruption. Marcus compiled everything they had learned about the silence into reports that read like science fiction, but were backed by solid data. Kevin Morris began training other engineers in the new technology because retrofitting every human outpost would take years. The United Earth Council finally voted to accept the silence's terms and implement the masking technology across all of human space. The vote was close and many people were angry, but the alternative was extinction. Patricia Kane authorized full-scale production of quantum masking systems and began the massive project of adapting every ship and station. Laura Bennett was promoted to admiral and given command of the new coexistence fleet that would maintain the boundary between human space and the wider universe. Jake stayed with the frontier because his enhanced consciousness made him invaluable. For working with the Silence. Nicole Sanders led the engineering teams that began retrofitting colonies. With the new technology, and progress was slower than anyone wanted but faster than anyone expected. The Silence seemed to understand what humanity was trying to do, and the spreading phenomenon slowed, giving them time to implement the masking. Sophie established the first embassy to the Silence at a station that existed partially in normal space and partially in the quantum realm where the entity lived. Marcus joined her there to study the Silence and learn everything humanity could about their new neighbor. 10 years passed, and humanity learned to live within boundaries they had never imagined accepting. Jake Harrison served as Admiral now, overseeing the coexistence fleet that patrolled the edge of human space, making sure nobody crossed the line the Silence had drawn. Every human outpost had been retrofitted with quantum masking technology, and the phenomenon that once threatened extinction had stopped spreading. Sophie Blake ran the embassy station, where she spent her days learning to communicate with an intelligence that existed across dimensions. Marcus Webb worked beside her, documenting everything they learned about the Silence and the true nature of space. The masking technology worked better than anyone had hoped, because it made human presence nearly invisible to the Silence, while still allowing humans to function normally. Ships traveled through space without tearing holes in causality, and colonies operated without causing the painful static that had driven the Silence to action. Lisa Park led research teams that studied the new data coming from the embassy, and each discovery opened up possibilities nobody had considered. The Silence wasn't just an entity living in space, but was instead woven into the fundamental fabric of reality itself. Laura Bennett commanded the fleet of enhanced humans who could perceive both normal space and the quantum realm where the Silence existed. Ryan Clark trained new pilots in techniques for flying through regions where physical constants shifted, because even with masking technology, some areas remained unstable. Kevin Morris continued improving the masking systems, and his latest designs were 90% more efficient than the original prototypes. Danny Wright had retired from active service but consulted on major decisions regarding humanity's relationship with the Silence. Jake visited the embassy station regularly to check on Sophie and Marcus, and each time he felt the presence of the Silence more clearly. His enhanced consciousness had continued developing over the years, and now he could almost understand the entity's thoughts. Sophie showed him the progress they had made in translation, and communication had evolved from crude mathematical patterns to something approaching actual dialogue. The Silence was teaching them about aspects of reality that humanity had never detected because normal human senses couldn't perceive them. Marcus made a breakthrough that changed everything when he discovered the Silence wasn't alone in the universe. Other entities existed in different regions of space, and each one had its own nature and rules. Some were similar to the Silence, preferring quiet and stillness, while others were more tolerant of activity and noise. Jake realized that by learning to coexist with one entity, humanity had learned the principles for coexisting with all of them. Patricia Kane was still Defense Commissioner, and she immediately saw the implications because this meant humanity could potentially expand again, but only in regions where the local entities would accept them. Sophie established contact with 3 other entities over the following year, and each one had different requirements for peaceful coexistence. One entity near the Orion Nebula actually seemed to enjoy human presence because the quantum fluctuations from human technology created patterns it found interesting. Another entity in the direction of Sagittarius was more hostile than the Silence, and made clear that humans were not welcome in its domain. Lisa Park theorized that space was full of these entities, and that humanity had been blind to them for centuries, because normal human consciousness couldn't perceive non-physical intelligence. The discovery sparked debates across human space because some people wanted to push into regions where entities were more welcoming, while others argued that humanity should respect all boundaries regardless. Jake found himself in the middle of these debates because his experience gave him perspective that few others had. He understood both the human desire to explore and grow, and the need to respect other forms of existence. Laura Bennett took the position that humanity should only expand where explicitly welcomed and never into regions where entities asked them to stay away. Greg Foster had been tracking illegal attempts to cross into forbidden zones, and reported that several groups were trying to establish colonies beyond the agreed boundaries. Patricia Kane ordered the coexistence fleet to enforce the agreements, and Jake led missions to shut down unauthorized settlements. Some colonists resisted, claiming that humanity shouldn't be restricted by alien entities, but Jake explained that the alternative was extinction. Ryan Clark helped evacuate these illegal colonies back to permitted space, and each mission reminded everyone why the boundaries existed. Kevin Morris developed a new generation of ships that could travel through space occupied by tolerant entities without causing any disruption at all. These vessels used principles learned from studying the silence and operated in harmony with the quantum fabric of space. Sophie tested the first prototype on a journey to the Orion entity, and reported that the entity seemed pleased by the ship's design. Marcus studied the interaction between ship and entity, and found that the new technology actually benefited both humans and the local space-dwelling intelligence. Nicole Sanders came out of retirement to lead a project creating sustainable colonies in regions where entities welcomed human presence. Her designs incorporated quantum masking and adaptive technology that allowed human settlements to exist without causing disruption. The first new colony was established near Orion with full permission from the local entity, and 200,000 volunteers moved there within the first year. Jake visited the colony and felt hope because this was expansion done right with respect and cooperation rather than exploitation. Lisa Park's research revealed that entities like the Silence had been shaping the universe for billions of years, and that many aspects of space that humans thought were natural were actually maintained by these beings. Stars formed in certain patterns because entities guided the process, and galaxies spiraled the way they did, because vast intelligences preferred that shape. Jake struggled to comprehend the implications because it meant humanity existed in a universe that was far more alive and conscious than anyone had ever imagined. The embassy station expanded as more enhanced humans joined Sophie and Marcus in studying the Silence. They learned that the entity had been dormant for millions of years before humanity's expansion woke it up. The Silence didn't hate humans, but had simply been startled by sudden noise in regions that had been quiet for eons. Sophie compared it to someone sleeping peacefully and then being woken by loud music and bright lights. Understanding this helped humanity develop better relationships with other entities they encountered. Danny Wright wrote a book about humanity's encounter with the Silence, and it became required reading in every school across human space. He argued that the crisis had been humanity's most important moment because it forced them to recognize that they weren't alone, and that intelligence took forms beyond human comprehension. Jake wrote the foreword explaining that humanity's greatest strength wasn't their technology or their determination, but their ability to adapt and learn. Laura Bennett contributed a chapter about the enhanced humans and their role as bridges between different forms of consciousness. 20 years after first contact with the Silence, human space had stabilized into a sustainable civilization that occupied 400 worlds within permitted zones. New colonies were being established in regions where entities welcomed humans, and research continued into understanding the true nature of space. Patricia Kane retired and handed command to Greg Foster, who maintained the policies of respect and coexistence. Jake remained active despite his age, because his enhanced physiology extended his lifespan, and his experience was invaluable. Sophie and Marcus had become the foremost experts on communicating with space-dwelling entities, and they trained new diplomats in the subtle art of quantum dialogue. Kevin Morris's masking technology had advanced to the point where human presence was nearly undetectable unless an entity specifically looked for it. Ryan Clark commanded a wing of scout ships exploring the boundaries of human space mapping regions where different entities held domain. Nicole Sanders continued designing colonies that existed in harmony with their quantum environment. 50 years had passed since humanity first encountered the Silence, and Jake Harrison stood on the observation deck of the embassy station watching stars that he now understood were tended by vast intelligences. His body had aged despite the enhancements, but his mind remained sharp, and his connection to the quantum realm had only grown stronger. Sophie Blake worked beside him, and together they had spent decades learning the language of space itself. Marcus Webb had passed away 5 years earlier, but his research continued through students who carried on his work. Laura Bennett had retired to Earth, where she wrote and lectured about humanity's transformation from conquerors to neighbors. Ryan Clark still flew scout missions at an age where normal humans would be long retired, and his enhanced perception had evolved to the point where he could sense entities light years away. Kevin Morris lived on the embassy station, now spending his final years perfecting masking technology that he hoped would last for centuries. Danny Wright had died peacefully, surrounded by family, and his book remained the definitive account of humanity's greatest crisis and greatest achievement. Patricia Kane lived in a care facility on Mars, but her mind was still clear, and she occasionally consulted on matters of policy. Greg Foster served as defense commissioner and maintained the delicate balance between human ambition and cosmic responsibility. Nicole Sanders had established a school for colony designers, where students learned to build settlements that enhanced rather than disrupted the quantum environment. Lisa Park worked from a research station near Jupiter, studying the fundamental nature of consciousness and its relationship to space. Jake received a message from Greg Foster requesting an urgent meeting, and when they connected via quantum link, the commissioner looked worried. 3 new entities had been detected in regions that humanity had assumed were empty, and all 3 were sending signals toward human space. Sophie joined the conversation because her expertise in entity communication was unmatched, and she studied the patterns Greg shared. Marcus's students worked around the clock analyzing the signals, trying to determine if they were greetings or warnings. The first entity existed in a region near the galactic core, and its signals suggested curiosity rather than hostility. The second entity occupied a vast area between spiral arms and seemed indifferent to humanity's existence. The third entity was different because its signals felt urgent and somehow desperate. Sophie focused on decoding the third entity's message, and what she found kept her awake for 3 nights straight. The entity was asking for help in the concept of a space-dwelling intelligence needing assistance. From humans seemed impossible. Jake called a council of all the enhanced humans who could travel to the embassy station, and 47 people arrived within a week. They represented humanity's best translators and diplomats for working with entities, and their combined consciousness created a bridge into the quantum realm stronger than any individual could manage. Ryan Clark shared his observations from scouting near the third entity's territory, and described spatial distortions that looked like wounds in reality itself. Kevin Morris analyzed the data and concluded that something was damaging the entity, possibly killing it. Laura Bennett came out of retirement to attend the council, and her experience proved valuable as they debated humanity's response. Some argued that humanity should focus on their own survival and avoid involvement in cosmic affairs they didn't fully understand. Others, including Jake, believed that helping an entity in need was both morally right and strategically wise, because it might lead to better relationships across space. Sophie worked with other translators to ask the silence what it knew about the distressed entity, and the response was troubling. The silence explained that the dying entity had been fighting something from beyond normal space for thousands of years and was losing the battle. The attacker came from a dimension that intersected with normal space in ways that caused damage to entities and could potentially harm physical matter as well. Jake felt cold dread, because if something could hurt beings as powerful as the silence, then humanity was completely outmatched. Lisa Park joined the discussion via link and proposed that humanity's unique perspective, as physical conscious beings, might offer solutions that entities couldn't perceive themselves. The council voted to investigate the situation, and Jake led a fleet of enhanced humans aboard ships equipped with the latest adaptive technology. Sophie came along to handle communication, while Ryan Clark commanded the scouts who would map the affected regions. Kevin Morris stayed at the embassy station coordinating technical support, because his age made deep space travel risky. The journey took 2 months even with advanced quantum drives, and Jake spent that time preparing his crew for something unprecedented. They arrived at the edge of the distressed entity's domain, and what they found was worse than anyone had imagined. Space itself was torn and bleeding in ways that violated every law of physics, and the entity's presence felt weak and fragmented. Sophie established contact, and the entity's response was barely coherent, like someone speaking through unbearable pain. Ryan's scouts detected the attacker, which wasn't physical but instead existed as a pattern that consumed and corrupted quantum information. Jake watched the pattern spread through space, eating away at the entity's consciousness, and realized this thing was like a virus, but one that infected reality itself. Lisa Park studied the data they sent back and worked with a team of scientists to understand what they were facing. The pattern had no intelligence or purpose but simply existed to consume and corrupt, spreading through dimensions that normal matter couldn't enter. The distressed entity had been holding it back for millennia but was finally failing. Sophie discovered that the pattern couldn't process information the way physical consciousness could and proposed, using that limitation as a weapon. Jake worked with her to develop a strategy using human ships and enhanced consciousness to create interference patterns that disrupted the attacker. Kevin Morris designed modifications to their quantum drives that would generate specific frequencies harmful to the consuming pattern. Laura Bennett coordinated with Earth and the colonies to send more ships and personnel because this fight would require everything humanity could commit. The battle began when Jake ordered his fleet to generate coordinated quantum pulses designed to disrupt the pattern's structure. The enhanced humans linked their consciousness together, creating a collective mind powerful enough to perceive and target the attacker directly. Ryan led strike teams using modified drives to cut through infected regions, burning away corruption. Sophie maintained contact with the dying entity, guiding it to focus its remaining strength on critical areas. The pattern fought back by corrupting nearby space, making it impossible for ships to maintain stable positions, and several crew members lost consciousness when their enhanced perception touched infected regions. Jake felt the strain of maintaining the quantum pulse but pushed harder, because failure meant losing both the entity and potentially giving the pattern access to human space. Kevin Morris monitored the technical systems and kept them running past safe limits because stopping meant death for everyone involved. Hours turned into days as the battle continued, and Jake lost track of time in the chaos of quantum combat. More ships arrived from human space, and Laura Bennett herself came aboard a command vessel to coordinate the growing fleet. Lisa Park discovered that the pattern originated from a collapsed dimension that was falling into normal space like a wound that wouldn't heal. Closing that wound would stop the pattern but required power, levels that humanity couldn't generate alone. Sophie proposed combining human technology with the entity's remaining strength to seal the dimensional breach. Jake agreed immediately, even though the plan required enhanced humans to link directly with the dying entity in ways that might destroy their consciousness. 12 volunteers, including Ryan Clark, stepped forward, willing to risk everything. They linked their minds with the entity, and together channeled enough power to seal the breach while Jake's fleet maintained the quantum pulses that held the pattern at bay. The dimensional breach sealed with a flash that lit up space in colors that human eyes weren't designed to see, and Jake felt the pattern collapse as its connection to the consuming void was severed. The enhanced humans who had linked with the entity slumped in their stations, and medical teams rushed to help them. Ryan Clark opened his eyes after 10 minutes, but something had changed in his gaze because he had touched consciousness on a scale that went beyond human comprehension. Sophie monitored the entity and reported that it was recovering, slowly healing the wounds that the pattern had inflicted over thousands of years. Jake ordered the fleet to maintain position while the entity stabilized, and crews worked around the clock, repairing ships damaged during the battle. 3 enhanced humans had died when their consciousness merged with the entity and couldn't separate cleanly back into individual minds. Laura Bennett conducted memorial services that honored their sacrifice and reminded everyone that they had saved not just one entity, but potentially all of human space. Kevin Morris reported that several ships needed complete quantum drive replacements because they had been pushed so far past safety limits. The entity that they had saved reached out to Sophie with gratitude that transcended language and offered humanity something unprecedented. It showed them regions of space where other entities would welcome human presence and shared knowledge about the true structure of the universe. Jake realized they were being given a gift more valuable than any physical resource, because this knowledge would transform humanity's understanding of everything. Lisa Park received the data transmitted back to Earth, and her team began the enormous task of incorporating this new information into human science. The Silence contacted the embassy station and expressed something that Sophie translated as approval mixed with respect. Other entities across known space sent signals acknowledging what humanity had done, and several that had been neutral or hostile changed their stance. Greg Foster saw the strategic implications immediately because humanity had proven they could be valuable allies rather than just tolerated neighbors. Patricia Kane sent a message from her care facility saying she was proud of how far humanity had come from the scared species that nearly went extinct. Jake brought the fleet home 3 months after the battle began, and Earth celebrated with parades and ceremonies that lasted for weeks. The enhanced humans who survived, including Ryan Clark, were honored as heroes who had risked everything to help an intelligence that most humans couldn't even perceive. Sophie and Marcus's students compiled reports detailing everything learned during the mission, and the data filled entire libraries. Kevin Morris received recognition for his engineering work but deflected praise, saying the victory belonged to everyone who had contributed. Nicole Sanders used the new knowledge from the saved entity to design a revolutionary type of colony that existed partially in quantum space, reducing the footprint even further. The first settlement using her design housed 1 million people, but appeared to normal sensors as barely larger than a small station. Danny Wright's legacy lived on through foundations that promoted understanding between humans and entities, ensuring future generations would never forget the lessons learned. Laura Bennett returned to retirement but continued, writing about humanity's ongoing journey as neighbors in a conscious universe. The saved entity recovered fully over the following decade and established regular communication, with humanity sharing insights about reality that led to breakthroughs in energy, medicine, and consciousness research. Jake remained active well into his 90s because enhanced humans age slower, and his experience made him invaluable as a mediator between different entities. Sophie took over as head of the embassy station when Jake finally stepped down, and continued his work building bridges across different forms of intelligence. Ryan Clark trained a new generation of pilots in techniques for navigating space where multiple entities held domain. 70 years after first contact, with the silence, humanity occupied 600 worlds spread across regions, where entities welcomed them or at least tolerated their presence. The population had grown to 30 billion people living in harmony with the quantum fabric of space. Kevin Morris died peacefully at age 112, leaving behind technology that would serve humanity for centuries. Lisa Park continued researching until her final days, making discoveries about consciousness that revolutionized understanding of what it meant to be alive and aware. Jake stood once more on the embassy station observation deck, now over 100 years old but still clear-minded thanks to enhancements that had transformed him decades ago. He watched Sophie work with young diplomats, teaching them the subtle art of quantum communication, and felt pride in how far humanity had come. The species that once believed they were alone and could take whatever they wanted had learned humility and cooperation. Marcus Webb's students had become teachers themselves, spreading knowledge about the true nature of space and humanity's place within it. New entities continued to reveal themselves as humanity explored, carefully and respectfully asking permission before entering any region. Some entities were ancient beyond human comprehension, while others were relatively young, having formed only millions of years ago. Each one was unique, with different preferences and different ways of experiencing reality. Jake had met representatives of 17 different entities during his lifetime, and each encounter taught him something new about the infinite diversity of consciousness. The pattern that nearly killed the saved entity had not returned, but humanity maintained vigilance, watching for dimensional breaches that might allow similar threats to emerge. Greg Foster established a permanent defense force trained specifically to combat dimensional threats, and they practiced constantly using tactics developed during the original battle. Laura Bennett's final book before her death was a comprehensive history of humanity's first century as a spacefaring species that lived alongside other intelligences, and it became required reading across human space. Ryan Clark finally retired at age 105 and spent his remaining years training the most gifted pilots in perception techniques that allowed them to navigate the most challenging regions of space. Sophie continued working past the age most enhanced humans retired, because her connection to the silence and other entities had become so deep that separating from that work seemed impossible. Nicole Sanders' school produced hundreds of colony designers who built settlements that enhanced the quantum environment rather than disrupting it. Jake received a message from the silence one quiet morning asking him to come to a specific region of space alone. Sophie offered to accompany him, but Jake knew this was something he needed to do himself. He took a small ship equipped with the latest adaptive technology and traveled for 2 weeks to the coordinates the silence had provided. What he found there was a region of space that existed in perfect harmony between physical matter and quantum consciousness. The silence manifested more clearly than Jake had ever experienced, and he finally understood what it truly was. Not a single entity, but a collective consciousness formed from trillions of quantum patterns that had evolved over billions of years. It showed him the history of the universe from perspectives humans had never imagined, and shared visions of possible futures where humanity continued growing wiser and more integrated with cosmic consciousness. Jake asked why he had been chosen for this gift, and the silence's answer was simple. Because he had been willing to learn and to change and to see humanity not as masters of space but as students of a universe far greater than any one species. Jake returned to the embassy station transformed by the experience and spent his final years writing about what he had seen. He died peacefully at age 107, surrounded by Sophie and the other enhanced humans who had become his family. His last words were that humanity's greatest achievement wasn't conquering space but learning to live within it. 100 years after Jake's death, humanity continued thriving across 100 worlds and had established positive relationships with over 50 different entities. The crisis that nearly destroyed them had instead become the foundation for a civilization that valued cooperation over conquest and wisdom over expansion. Children learned about Jake Harrison and Sophie Blake and Marcus Webb and all the others who transformed humanity from a threat into a welcomed presence. The universe remained vast and full of mysteries, but humanity no longer faced it alone or with arrogance, but instead with curiosity, respect, and the knowledge that they were part of something infinitely larger than themselves.